Okay, and we're back. It is COMP123, summer 2016 semester, and it's week 2, part 3 of our broadcast. Last time we were together, we were talking about this little function up here, or this little thing we were writing. So we have our program class, and what I was doing last day with you is I wrote a couple of console writes, and then what we did was we created this new method called read until the end, read until end, right? Which is basically continuously reading from the console until we put the end in, right? Okay, so we did that. We also made a test. Here's the test for the other two. We refactored, where we kind of create a test for the other two methods, right? So add x and y test method, and the other one was add y to x test method. How about making a test for this one? How do we test this one out, right? Because remember, we're getting input from the console constantly. This is a little bit more challenging to test. Let's think about this. I return my inputs, so that's what I return, right? One thing I know is the inputs is an array. So what could I test for if I return my array? Can't really test for what I'm inputting. What could I test for? I could test for the length of my array. I can definitely test for it to be more than 1, right? So, or more than, it can't be empty. So it can't be 0. So the length can't be 0. That's one thing. I can test for that. So if it's 0, that means something didn't go right, right? Because, you know, I'm getting, you know, if I start inputting stuff, it should be more than 1. I can do that. How about other things? You said, what were you saying again? For instead of just, what else could I test for? How about the any output? I mean, really, all we're doing is we're testing to see if we're getting input that I can read continuously from my console, right? So it keeps reading, reading, reading until I put end. Somehow, end has got to stop it, right? Here's the question: does end, if I put the string end into my array, so if my array is an inputs array, I enter end. Does it get added into my array? Just asking. Come on, guys. Think about this. Huh? So the word, remember, let's run this thing so you see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to do this running without debugging. Okay, so I'm going to run this thing without debugging. Here it is. So I've got my couple of calculations we did up top there. And then I'm going to say, I don't know, some names or words or whatever I want. Tom, right? Mark. It's going to keep asking me to do this. You know, Joe, Mary, right? And then I put the word end in there. I press enter and it stops, right? So when I put the word end, does the word end get carried into my array? Is it inside my array somehow? Yes or no? What do you think? The way I've written the code. The answer is yeah, right? Because I keep inputting, right? And I use the input counter. The input counter increments. Here's my incrementing. Input counter is incrementing, and then I read line into the input counter, whatever I wrote, and then I test to see if it's end, if the last one is end, right? So I could test that at least one of my inputs, the last input, the last part of my array, so array minus 1, whatever it's going to be, right, that it's end. I could test for that. That is something that will test part of my process. So those are the things I want you to think about when you create a test, what you're testing for. I'm testing to make sure that I got what the method does what I want it to do, which is continuously read. Okay, so let's make this this test a little bit more interesting. This is a little bit more challenging than the other simple tests we did. Okay, so we have to work on it a little bit more for this one. So I'm going to copy this whole stuff when I create a test. Remember, even the test filter, this is the header, right? You need to include this in the test when we create our test. Okay, so grab all this, grab the test. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go down to just below the test and then paste it, right? Now we need to change the test method, and I want to kind of match the name of the test method to the name of my method that I'm testing. So I'm going to copy this method name, go back here, and then I'll kind of put it before the test and kind of paste it in there. So it's read until end test method. That's what it's supposed to be for. In my arrange, right, component, my arrange piece, I got to think about what I need do I need to arrange any kind of, what am I testing for? If I want to test for the last element of my array, I need to test a couple things, right? So maybe expected length, expected minimum length will be 1. So I have 2 expectations now. I don't just have 1. One, the array length has to be at least greater than 0, right? It can't have 1. It can't have no entry. The array can't be empty, right? That's number 1. And the second thing is at least the last entry in the array has to be end, because that's what I'm asking for, right? Those 2 things. So let's do this. So it's not just expected results, right? My expected result isn't incorrect the way it is right now. I have to change the way we arrange stuff. In fact, we can wipe some of this stuff out and use this as a stub, because this is all going to be different now, right? And let's take a look at also, we know we made this public static, so we can access it with read until end, right? It's going to return the whole array itself, right? Which is good, which means we can access the properties of it. So if I return the array, if it returns the array, I have to have an array to, to kind of like, copy one of the array that I'm going to get from read until end. I got to copy it somewhere. So I have to have a container for that. So I need an array. So this is returned array is what I'm going to call it. So it's an array of strings, right? So a string array is the first thing. And this is my returned array. That's what I'm getting, right? And I'm just going to leave it like this for now, because now do I have to declare it? Do I have to say my string array is a returned array of a certain size? Well, no, because remember, we passed by reference here. Okay. And what I want to do here in my act, this is the first part of what I'm doing, and I'll come back to arrange in a second, is I want to say something like this: returned array is equal to, and then I'm going to call my method, so it's going to be program dot, and then it's read until end, right? And this is working, right? This is fine, because returned array is because my program, my method read until end generates an array, right? See, it returns a string array. Here's my string array that it returns. I don't have to declare a new one, because this returned array is just going to be equal to the other string array that I'm getting back. So I don't have to return anything. And it's going to be initialized based on what I see here. All right, so that's the first thing. So returned array. I'm going to get this back. Here's my string. In my assert, one of the first tests I'm going to do here in my test method is do something like this. I'm going to say something like, well, the returned array length, right? Because I can, if you notice, because returned array, it's got methods attached to it because it's an array type. So I can do something like array length, right? And it's got to be greater than 0, right? So let me see if I can do that with an assert. Assert dot, and then it's, if you notice, it says array are equal, are not equal, are same, right? Equals, right? And is not null. That's good. I like that that thing. Is true, right? All kinds of stuff that you can test for. These are all the tests that you can make. Are the same or not the same. So so I'm testing for something that's greater than 0, right? So it has to be at least 1, right? And I can also say is not equal or is not, right? One of those kind of things. So is not null, is true. That so is true is kind of interesting, because if you look at it, it says void Boolean is a condition that I can put in there, right? A Boolean condition has to be true, that this thing is greater than 0. So let's try is true. It's true that, and here's my Boolean condition, right? That my returned array, right? We're going to say is greater than, dot length. We're going to say, to make it fail at the beginning, right? We're going to make it exactly equal to 0, right? That'll fail. So we'll do this part of the test first. So we'll say, remember, we have to make it fail first, then we have to make a pass, then we have to make a refactor, right? Or we've refactored for better code execution. So again, so here's my string array, here's my returned array. I'm checking to see if my array length is equal to 0, right? That kind of stuff. If it's true that it's equal to 0, it's never going to be equal to 0 if we did it right properly, right? Because I'm always going to get an end. That's what I'm hoping to get, right? And then we'll fail the first test. Let's look at my test explorer here for a second. Here it is. And you can see that we have a couple of tests that were not run yet. Here's my other test, right? And let's save everything. And we're going to build the project, build my solution, just because I want to, sometimes it's best for us to build the solution first and then run everything. And now I'm going to run all tests. Now, I should see my read until end test method fail. Let's try this out. So run all. So it's going to go out, it's going to run the first one, and then my read until test method fail. Why? Because if I look at the failure, if I click onto it, right, or if I try and look and see why it failed, like why did this thing fail? If I click on this thing, it says that through an exception, index was outside the bounds of the array, right? So returned array.length is equal to 0, and that's not really what I wanted to get, right? Because my returned array length is going to always be equal to 0 here. I have a problem testing this thing. Why? Why was this not working, this test that I'm trying to do? Anybody have an idea? I can't enter results in here, right? I can't enter any results in here at all. I can't emulate my test because my test requires it requires me to enter data into my method, right? This is the first time I've had this problem. So how do I do that? I can emulate data by accepting a parameter in my method, right? Like a default parameter, right, from my array, right? So it's either this or that. So it's hard to test this one because I'm trying to get input from my console, and I'm testing input from my console to get an array length. That's what's happening, okay? And that's why it says returned array length is equal to 0, right? Because my returned array, I didn't have a chance to offer any input in here, right? Let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm not saying it's impossible to create a test for this one. I just want you to know that when we start doing this kind of thing, you're going to see that there's some problems, right? Okay, here's the example what I'm talking about here. So I'm in my do loop. We're going to talk about the do loop in a second. I'm entering a value, and I'm pressing end to stop. That's cool. But I never do this thing, right? I never test this thing. So how do I refactor or re-engineer this method so I make it so it's easy to test? That's the first way to think about it. How do I do that? Or it's easier to test. I could ask for input, like, for example, a default string or whatever that I'm going to enter in. I could do that. And if, as an example, somehow I don't enter the data, I'm going to accept the string input as the stuff I'm getting. Okay, that's one thing I could do. Also, because I'm accepting my inputs as my array, right? My inputs won't be initialized at all because I'm not running this console read line, right? So I could initialize this thing, my inputs, right? My first string, I could initialize it originally somewhere in here. I can initialize all the values, right? Or the first one at least with the null, like, so it has something inside of it. Because right now, even with the first one, the array length is always going to be nothing. It's not going to be there's not going to be any value to it because I haven't initialized my array at all by the time it pumps this out, right? So again, this is good. This is a good way to look at it because now I'm thinking, I'm never going to be able to get input for my method to test, unless we do something like this. If I say something like inputs for the first one, right? Before we do my do loop, right, or right at the beginning of my do loop, I initialize it. So before we do any kind of input, let's console.readline, right, because it's going to kind of come into my do loop. I initialize it with a blank character, right? Now it's going to do this once. It's going to go through here. And no matter what happens, I'm going to get at least one iteration of this thing where my inputs is going to have at least one pass-through, okay? It's never going to end, right? So once I go in here, it's not going to stop. But I'll still get one pass-through. It'll go through this one time, at least. So what I can do, right, is I can do something like this. Before the read line, I can say something like inputs. I'm trying to re-engineer it here. Inputs counter, right, is equal to blank. This is not empty. This is actually putting a blank string in there, right? So I actually have something in there, because originally it becomes null. There is no empty string that part of the array. And then it begs to ask the question: should I be using an array structure for this method in the first place, right? Because I have to say that the minimum length of my object is 100 elements. I have 100 elements, 100 containers, and when I'm testing the size of my array, inputs.length, right? I'm getting a weird number. And we also have to think about our methodology too in a second. All right, so I'm saving this thing. I've made one change. All I'm doing is I'm doing this. Let's see if the test passes this time, or if it fails again, but without the same failure. That was a weird failure, right? We don't want that kind of failure. Let's run all the tests again. So blah, 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 running, and we failed this one. Okay, let's see why it failed this time. So is it the same? Right? So through an exception, index was outside the bounds of the array. Right? Well, that's weird, because array length, the returned array.length, right, is equal to 0. We're testing to see if the returned array.length, and right now the returned array.length is undefined kind of thing. Okay, here's something we can do without clicking. You notice there's run and debug, right? If I was clicking debug, right, one thing it does is it allows us to show me the test, show me what the test is going to be. And it actually takes me, in my program, it says console.readline. This is where I first start taking some input in. When I click on the debug piece, right, it says index out of range, right? Now, we didn't change anything last time and it was working. It even worked earlier today. How come I'm getting an index out of range here, right? Because my counter starts at 0, right, which is where it should start, right? But somehow I'm getting an error. Let's try this again without debugging, all right? So I got my program, and I'm going to run it for a second. Let's just try this out. So I want to run this thing without debugging, right? Let's try this out. So see how this is continue? Because unfortunately for me, what's happened is I'm still running my tests, right? Take a look. See my failed test. If I run all, just for a second there, it's going to fail. Sorry. Let's run this without debugging. So Control F5, right? Just for a second. So here I am, and I enter my end, and I press enter, and I'm good, right? This is good. Here's what's happening. I'm actually outputting somewhere in my code, right? This is what's causing the error as well. This console.writeLine read until the end. I'm actually outputting this code somewhere, right? Read until the end. And my question to you is, once I do this, right? Yeah, this is nice, because I have to call it somewhere else. This method won't run. But if this method doesn't output anything, then my console.writeLine will produce 0. Won't produce anything at all. So this might be the cause of it up here. And remember, what I'm actually doing is returning something when I call the method, right? So let's not do a console.writeLine here. Let's just call the method. That's the first thing we want to look at. There's some debugging. Okay, let's try this again. And I'll start with debugging and see if we get any kind of errors in our code, right? So hard to see here. Hold on, I'll make it a little bigger. Properties. Let's try this to make it a little bigger. So we'll see the console, and that's better. And if I type in end, I'm good. I don't have any errors, and it goes away. All right. That's a good thing. It didn't generate any kind of errors in this case either, both ways. Right now, remember, I'm not getting an output. I'm not getting an output from this thing, right? Because even though I'm returning inputs, which is the array, that's what I'm returning, right? I'm still not getting any kind of, I'm not reading anything from this piece. So let's see if this is the cause of our error. I'm not using a console.writeLine anymore. And I'll tell you probably it's not going to be. If I run all the tests now in my test explorer, you can see that I still failed the test, right? Let's see why it failed, right? So let's see what it is. That's not passing. We can see, if I look at this is the one that I want to look at, right? And I'm still throwing an exception that I'm out of bounds. Let's do some more outputs, right, while we're reading the array. Let's do the array length while we're coding this little method here, right? So this didn't really do much for us, this piece, right? Inputs counter, even when we initialized it, once we went into our do loop, things went awry, right? Let's do this. So we're reading the array. Here's reading the array. We're testing to see if this piece here, the second piece, tests to see if it's the end. And if it's the end, we stop, right? But let's output what we've written in, like something like you typed and blah, blah, blah. Right, so console, do CW. And then inside there, we'll say you typed. And then whatever was typed, which is the input counter, just to see what we're getting, if we're actually taking anything into the array. Because my assumption is that we're actually reading something into the array. But let's see if we actually can retain what we've typed. So let's do that first. And we'll take this. This is something temporary we're going to take away. Let's run this thing without debugging, right? So run without debugging. We press, Tom, and then you type Tom. So we know we're getting stuff in. If I press end, you typed end. So that's going into my array. And it says press any key to continue because it's going to stop, right? So we know this is working, okay? Let's type my array length, right? So instead of console what you typed, array length, right? This is just debugging, right? To help us. Array length is equal to what? Our inputs.length. We talked about this before. Inputs.length. And we're looking at it so that it is not 0, right? So let's try this out. So inputs.length, right? Because length is a property of the inputs array. An array is a complex type. It's not like an integer or a string or something else. Even actually a string is a little more complex. It's not like an integer or decimal or some kind of double. It's a complex type. It has properties built in. Let's check this out. Let's run without debugging again. So Control F5. Put a name, a value, Tom. Uh-oh. Why is it like this? Array length. See what I'm saying? Something's not right here. Let's try this again. So our idea was the array length is counting. It's counting, right? That it's always going to be equal to 100. Why? Because we've initialized it as 100, so therefore it can never be anything but 100. So our test would always fail. Even if we wanted to say it's always pass. It would always pass because if we actually got it to count what's the array length, because my array length is always 100, right? This would be an issue. Here's the other thing. Have you figured out yet why we're failing? Because we've made another assumption, right? Why this is causing us to have an error. I'll show you what I'm talking about. The assumption in my test is that I don't have to declare returned array as a new array of 100. That's the assumption. That assumption, my friends, is wrong, right? We're saying, hey, it's a type, and I'm getting it back from here. Returned array is equal to this array, right? I'm pointing it in. It's returning an array, so therefore I shouldn't have to declare it. Well, let's try if we do declare. If I did something like this, is equal to a new string array. Let's try this out. I'll show you something, and put in there 100, right? We know it's an array of 100 now. Both are arrays of 100, one and the other one. Let's see if I run this test now what I get. So run. Okay, it failed. Well, let's see why it failed this time. It says, well, it threw an exception again. So my index was outside the bounds of the array somehow, because my returned array.length is equal to 0. And we're testing if this is true. Okay. Remember that I can't do much in here when I'm running my test, right? Well, let's do a couple things. Let's stop this. Here's one thing we haven't done in our test. Can I do a console.writeLine in my test? Not in my actual code, my program.cs. Is that possible? Do I have access to a console here? And let's see if that works. So if I was going to say something like, before we get to this, because my test isn't passing, right? Or my test is weird, right? So I get some weird results. Before I get here, can I return my array length? Can I do something like console.writeLine Can I do something like returned array dot length? Can I do that? Is that possible? So I'm testing for it's a number, right? It should be some kind of integer that I'm getting back. And here my test is wrong, right? Let's just test this out and see what happens. So I'm going to run the test. So here's running all the tests. I do that. When I come back to here, it fails spectacularly again. But let's see what I get. Do I get anywhere that says my console? Well, look what I got here. I got this thing called output. Take a look at that, right? And here's my output. Enter a value, end, stop. Enter a value, end, stop. And then it keeps going and keeps going. This is interesting. Keeps going until, uh-oh, what's going on? It'll keep going forever. It's an endless loop. It's an endless loop, right? Why? Because my data that's coming from the console, right, is going to always ask, it's going to keep entering nothing until it comes to the end. It's always looking for end to stop. So it's an endless loop. It's not a for loop. It's going to end or whatever. So how do we end the array, right? If somehow, remember, we can only have 100 entries in this particular case, and this is a great test for us, right? We might have this real problem in real life if somehow someone enters 100 entries, right? So this indicates our error, a problem. So what I need to do is this. There's two conditions to stop my do while. One condition is if I press end, and the other one is if it goes beyond 100. That's what I got to change in my thing to stop this error from happening. Let's do that, right? Because this is my output. So what I'm talking about is inside of our program, the only condition we have down here is input not equal to -1. Yeah, okay. But what about the possibility that I can go beyond 100 entries? That's also possible, right? So let's put that in. So this is 1. So both conditions have to be true. What's the condition that I need to use to compare one with the other? Do I use the AND in C#, or is it the double ampersand? What's the operator to have two conditions? Who remembers? Double ampersand, okay. And if that's true, so both conditions must be true. So input counter is not equal to 1, not -1. We're going to go back and refactor this in a second because there's an easier way to do this. And my input counter cannot be more greater than 100, right? So when I increment this input counter, if it only time is it's going to be while this is less than 100 or less than 101, right? Or less than or equal to 100, right? Something like that. But greater than 0. Like this, it has to be a condition where we check to see that it doesn't go over 100. So less than 101 or something like that. All right, so let's try this out. So and input counter, right, is less than 101, right? Because if it's 100, we're good, right? But if it's less than 101, now this is weird because 101 is a weird number, right? What's the other thing we can do that we can fix? We can fix this up. I'm putting two external brackets here. This is the syntax you need, right? So I'm doing these two things. So less than 101, and it cannot be, the input counter can't be -1, and it can also not be less than 101. If one of those conditions is met, both of these conditions must be true in order for us to keep counting, okay? This is why a do-while loop or a while loop is more powerful in some ways than a for loop. For loop can only have one condition, right? Typically. Let's check this out. Let's see if this passes now. I'm going to go back to my test. It should still fail, but actually, it might pass now, right? Let's see what happens, right? So let's run the test. It passes, and then it fails. Okay, let's see what it failed this time. It says it threw an exception. It was outside the bounds of the array. Hold on a second. Wait a minute. Oh. That's bad. Can I have 100? Here's another thing. I went to 101. Can it be 101, the index? Because remember, it's the array length -1. It starts counting at 0, not 1, right? So therefore, it has to be less than 100. So that's wrong. So again, I'm refactoring. I'm fixing my problem, right? I put the wrong number in there, right? So let's try this out. So less than 100, right? Okay. So now the thing I don't like about this is it's a hard-coded value. And this is a hard-coded value. I don't like those two things. That means like if I want to change that later on, I got to go into my code and change it up. It's a very, I have no choice how big it's going to be, how many entries I'm going to make, right? So that makes me feel that I should have a number of entries that are, it's variable. I should be able to put in the number of entries. How many inputs do I want? How many names do I want to enter into my list? Maybe I should ask the user that, and then I can modify my method so it has a number of entries. When I declare my array length, this is my array length, I'm going to get the number of entries based on what I enter. Different kind of method. You see how I'm refactoring in my mind? I'm thinking about this as I'm creating my method, right? Okay, let's do the next piece. Let's try this out again. So I save everything. Let's rebuild it. Well, after this thing, after my method goes through, hold on a second. Whew, okay. I'll just build my solution really quickly so that I know there's no errors. Good. And now I'm going to go back to my test here, and let's test all again. Again, 2 should pass, 1 should fail, or let's see if it does fail. Okay, good. Looks like it failed again. Let's see why it failed. Okay, this is a different message. Look, test failed, read until end test method. Message assert is true failed, right? Because my array length is equal to 0. Of course that's going to fail, because it's always going to be equal to 100, right? So that is going to always fail, right? Well, now it begs to differ. Remember we talked about test-driven development. It makes no sense for me to have a fixed number like 100 entries or 5 entries or 10 entries or whatever it's going to be. I should ask the user for how many entries he wants to add in. So let's check this out and see if it works. If I refactor, can anyone suggest what I should put in here? So I want to make it so that the user tells me how many entries to put in. Yes. For loop, what else?
Can I do one thing? We can initialize the index of the inputs after initializing declaration of input counter. Like we can insert the input counter in back. Then it will not get any error. It will not have any absolute index counter.
Well, index counter is okay. It starts at 0. That's fine. It always should start at 0, right? That's okay. I'm talking about this index. Yeah, in order for us to get, that's what I'm talking about. So in order for me to get a variable number, instead of always being 100, I want to have more flexibility with my method. How do I get input from the user to tell me how big it is? Right? That's what I'm asking. So in other words, how many names do you want to enter, kind of thing. And then I generate my the number, right? As opposed to a fixed number like 100, right? Well, remember what our best practices are is we have our inner method, and we're talking about advanced methods here, right? In the method, inside this thing is we do all our variable declaration right here at the top of our method. That's where we normally do our variable declaration. So inside of our method, then we have some kind of execution, execution of code, right? Usually it's some kind of, I don't know, we have a little bit of conditional statements. We might have some looping statements, things that we're going to reuse over and over again. Can I ask something first, like from the user, right, as an example, and then depending on what I get in, can I declare my variable? Well, in a method, the answer should be no. You shouldn't do some kind of console.readline and then declare it over here. But there's nothing going to stop us from doing it up here. So remember, we call it from the program. I could ask something like, how many names do you want to read, right? In my write line here. So how many names do you want to read? Let's try this out. So, or how many entries do you want to make? So console.writeLine, how many entries do you want to make? Right? And they can add whatever number of entries they want, right? And let's say we're going to make, instead of a console.write, we'll make it a console. Or a write line, make it console.write. Here we go. And then we'll have another little read statement. So we'll have a console.read, the number of entries, which is, we'll declare up here. So we'll say int is number of entries, right? We'll set it to 0, initialize it to 0 up here. And then down here, we'll say number of entries is equal to console.read. Maybe read line. We'll do console.readline. And we'll say something like, we'll read the number of entries from here, okay? But here's the problem. Can I take, there's number of entries is an integer, right? And console.readLine returns a string. So I need to parse this, going back to the parse methods we saw in the PowerPoint. I need to parse this as an integer. How do I do that? Anybody remember? What's the parse methods that we got from the PowerPoint? Let's go to the PowerPoint. Convert dot, I could, right? That's where it's somewhere down here. Convert methodologies here. I want to make sure yeah, here it is. So I could use convert or I could use int parse, right? Both are okay. Convert to int32, console.readline. Actually, it's right here, right? Or int parse. Which one do you guys prefer? Or we could try this new one, try parse. But we need an out parameter for that one. We talked about out parameters. Might as well use an out parameter here because this is the example that we're doing today, right? So instead of declaring a variable and we're making it equal to, we'll just use the try parse, right? So try parse, and it returns a Boolean, right? And how do I use that? This is the way we do it. We try parse, int.try parse. We want to kind of convert it to integer. And then we have our out. Okay? This is what's going to receive. The second piece is what's going to receive the what we're getting, right? So I could put my console.readline in here without a variable like entry string, and then my out, and then the whatever the number of entries are on this side. That's what it's going to be like. Okay, let's try this out. So what it's forcing me to do is look what my testing is forcing me to. It's forcing me to think about how I'm going to refactor my method already, right? Before I even do a pass, I'm failing, and I'm like, okay, something's wrong, right? It's not working like it should be working. My idea is nice, Tom, but it's not happening. It's not really flexible. What can I do to fix it? You know, that kind of stuff, right? That's how I want you guys to think. Now, we're pretty messy up here, but don't worry because this is just all demonstration stuff, right? Okay, so we don't need to do this number of entries. Number of entries is the number that we're going to use, but we need to do this. So let's try this again a little bit differently. Int.try parse, right? And then the first piece is the string that I'm going to get. We're going to get a console.readline. That's going to produce the string that we want, plus, right, out, and we're going to use number of entries, right? That's the out parameter. That's how we write it in one line. So a little bit more effective. We're going to try and parse whatever we get here into an integer. If it fails, right, well, that's bad. What if the person enters a B instead of a number? That's bad too, right? So we can also wrap this in a try-catch block, right, if we want to. You guys ever did any kind of try-catch blocks in the first course, Programming 1? No? Yes or no? Okay, no. Well, so we'll talk about that later. All right. So a try-catch block is almost like I want to try and do exception handling. Exception handling means that when I'm getting entry from the console, my user can enter whatever he wants. He can also mess me up. He can enter a Q instead of a number, right? Whatever. So I gotta stop that from happening. I gotta make sure that the user, right, enters a proper number, like from something that's greater than 1, as an example, should be greater than 0 actually, because it can't be to 0 entries, right? And it should be something less than 10 million, right? Something that's not going to keep going forever, right? Okay, so let's try this out and see what happens. I'm going to get a number here, right? That's the number of things I'm going to get, and then I'm going to pass it into my read until end, right? And my read until end isn't really named properly anymore. It should be read until end or until the number, whatever the number the user gives me, right? So let's pass in that number. So we'll say number of entries, right? Now this is going to cause a problem because my method doesn't take a number of entries. It doesn't take an integer, right? But we're going to make it do that. So here's where we're refactoring a little bit. So we're going to go back down to here, into read until end, and change my method so it says, it kind of asks for an integer, which is kind of like a number, some kind of counter or a count number. We'll just call it number of entries too. Number of entries. There we go. So that's the first thing we need to do. Change that. Okay. Now this number of entries is how we're going to initialize our string. So we're going to put this number into our string. It's going to be variable this way, right? So this is number of entries, which makes our method more flexible, right? Because now it won't just have 100, it'll have whatever. Okay, that's number one. Then it makes it easier for me to test because I know that the maximum number of entries I can test is like 10. And I can arrange that in my test. So before I run my test, I have to refactor my test in a second, right? Let's see how this works. So if I enter 10 entries, or 5 entries, make it something small, 5 entries, after 5 entries, it'll stop, or if I press end, one of the two. Let's try to test this out. So run it. I'm running with debugging now, okay? And how many entries do I want to make? I want to do 5 entries. Enter. Okay, enter a value. So here's my first one. Array length 5. We're going to take that away in a second. Mark, Jim, Mary. I don't know, something else. How about Jack? Oh, what happened? I got an array. I got an exception. How come? Right? So something failed. Something. I went beyond the point of no return, kind of thing. Right? How come? Well, somehow I passed my test. Right? Let's check this out and see what happens. Well, I know what I did. Do you know what I did? I left the 100 in there. It shouldn't be that. It should be less than the number of entries, right? So that's the first thing. I'm just refactoring my code here. All right, so there's my number of entries. Let's try this again. We'll try it again. Okay. Again, we're just working on one method to make it work. Okay. So again, I'll make it instead of 5, I'll make it 3. So it's quick. Let's say Tom, Mark, and Larry. Enter. Stop. We're good, right? This is a good test. Okay. Now we'll use the end as well. Let's try this out. So let's run the test again, and right away I want to make 2 entries. Right? But before I do anything, I press end. Okay, stop. Right? So both work well. Right? Both work well. Okay, so this is good. We can test this kind of stuff. We also return inputs, but I also know that now my number of entries, it really depends. The number of iterations here depends on how many entries I enter. Right? Here's something. Somewhere inside my array, out of the, if I say 5 entries, out of the 5 entries, the 5 positions in my array, somewhere in there, right? There's 2 possibilities. I either have to have it has to meet the number of the size of my array, right? Has to be there's got to be entries for each one of my array length. That's how I could test it. And the second thing is that it's got to stop after 5 somehow, right? It's got to stop with an end somewhere. Both things should work, either one or the other. All right. So now how do I refactor my test? Because this is a lot different what I did here. Okay, so if I go back to my unit test, I know that this is going to fail now because my read until test method, when I go here I have an error, right? Read until end needs a number, right? So the number of entries is something that I'm going to put in here now as an integer. So I'm going to say integer, number of entries. We're going to make this a fixed number, like 5, right? And then look at then here, instead of declaring a new string of 100, it's going to be a new string of number of entries. Okay? And we're going to pass in number of entries in here, number of entries, right? Which is going to satisfy the requirements for my returned array. Okay, so I'm checking to see if my array length is equal to 0, right? That shouldn't be the one I do, right? I want to know if my iterations, how many times I go through the loop, right? How many times I go through the loop is at least the number of entries if I don't press the word end, right? And in this case, I don't have a chance to press the word end. I will never have a chance to press the word end because I can't do any kind of input here the way I've written it. So I'm testing not for the array, the returned array length, but the number of entries. So going back to my program, instead of returning inputs, I'm going to return the number, the iterations, my input counter. Right? So let's do that. So instead of a string array, I'm returning a string array, I'm going to return an integer, right? And I'm going to return my input counter, right? Now remember, my input counter is going to increment, and then it's going to be tested to see that it's less than the number of entries. So I got to return my input counter minus 1. Because my input counter is always going to be, or should be always, larger than my number of entries. And let me show you this. I return input counter, right? And if I go through if I step through this thing with you, right? I go through the iteration once. My input counter is now 1, right? That's what it becomes. From 0, it goes to 1, because I'm always going to go through the array at least one time, right? Okay, good. Now let's say he put in 1 entry. So I'm going to say, well, if my input counter, 1, is less than the number of entries, 1, it fails, right? So now my input counter is 1. That's what comes out of my array. Okay, let's try 2. So my input counter, my number of entries I asked for is 2. My input counter is 0. It goes through this, gets my entry. My input counter goes to 1, right? Is 1 less than 2? Yes, it goes back to the loop, right? I get another input. My input counter goes to 2, right? Is 2 less than 2? No, it's equal to 2. It fails, and my input counter goes to 2. Did I do what is it counting right? Yes. So that's how I do it, right? Because I want to get it to 2. If I enter something else, if I put an end, my input counter may not get to 2. I could exit before my condition, but I don't have the option of doing that in my test. Okay. So now my test has changed. Let's go back to my test. By the way, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I want to show you how to, how I'm thinking in order for me to make this test work. Okay. So now my returned array isn't going to be what I care too much about. In fact, I don't care about this at all. Right? What I really care about is instead of my returned array, I want to get the total count, my expected count, and what my actual count is. Now we're talking. All right. So number of entries is 5. Integer expected count. Right. I'm going to say is equal to 0 to fail it. Right? And then my actual count is what this is, right? So I'm going to say int actual count. We'll start that off at 0 as well. And then actual count will be this. Here's my actual count, here's my expected count. And now I don't do an array is true. I do an assert dot r equal, where my expected count, back to what we did before, and my actual count are the ones that are compared. This is incorrect, so I'll get rid of this. I don't care about this anymore. My test becomes much simpler. Okay, this will fail because my expected count is not going to ever reach 0. It's always going to be greater than 0, right? And my actual count is going to be definitely different. So this is going to fail. Let's run this test. Okay, good. So it's failed. And if I look at the failure, it says that, well, I expected 0, but I actually got 5. Right? So what I'm hoping is that my expected count, it should be the same as my number of entries. So I'm putting in the number of entries as 5. My expected count is there. There we go. And let's run the test again. I should pass. Right? All 3 pass because my expected count matches my number of entries. So it goes through the loop, my little algorithm, 5 times because I don't have any capacity to enter an end. If I did, it would fail. This would fail because I could change it from 5 or lower. This is good. So I've already refactored. Red, green, refactor. I'm not ready to I'm ready to refactor now my actual thing to make it more efficient. Could you see an opportunity for my program, in my program here, to make this more efficient than the way I've written it? Well, there is an easy way to make it more efficient. Anybody? Any suggestions? Come on, guys. You guys are not just watching me. You're doing with me. Do with me. Help me out here. You're the coder. I'm doing a program review. I'm your boss. And I'm trying to look and see how efficient you're coding. Tell me if there's a better way to write this. A ternary at the while. Not really there. I wouldn't do it there. What else? What else could I do? What else? I could do a ternary here, right? This if statement. I could turn this into a ternary because if else. 2 statements, either one or the other, I could turn this into a ternary operator, right? That's one option, but that doesn't really solve my problem. What else? What were you going to say? Could use ref, but that's not going to really help me either. How about taking out this whole thing? I want to remove this. This is a eyesore for me. If else, the more conditions, the more lines I'm doing if else, doesn't make any sense. I know for a fact I always want to do an input counter, right? I'll tell you what I'm talking about here, right? Because it doesn't matter, right? Either way, if the way this works, I'll show you why. I'm going to get something from the console anyway. If I get an end, why do I have to convert it to a -1? Right? I'm converting it to a -1. So why don't I just compare what I'm getting? So if my the stuff I'm getting, but let me just take this out too. I don't need this anymore. This is just debugging. That's another thing that's the first thing I'm going to refactor, right? I'm listing for an end or the number of entries, right? One of the two. If I'm listing for an end, well, why don't I just compare my input counter, right? Instead of it being -1, what if I compare input counter to what it's supposed to be, right? Well, that's the first thing. Now, how do I increment? That's the problem. If I do that, if I take this situation out, the reason why I can't do it like the way I'm thinking is because input counter would have to be, I'd have to look back at the input counter -1 because I'm incrementing by 1, right? Before I check my condition. So I'm going back down here, and then I'm going to increment my number. So I'm going to go to the next index, and I'm checking the wrong one, so it's never going to be true, right? It's never going to be end, right? So it's going to pass. It's always going to pass forever and ever and ever, right? So I have to check back one if I'm going to refactor -1. Whatever my input counter is, -1. I'd have to do that over here in the test if I was going to refactor this. Here's what I'm talking about. So we're going to get rid of this. Bear with me, right? I don't need this piece, and I don't need all of this, right? I do need my input counter incrementing because it has to increment, right? Somehow it has to work. This must stay, right? However, my test down here can change. So this would be inputs, then in brackets, input counter -1, right, is not equal to end, right? That handles everything that I did in my input statement, in my if, in one line, right? And let's get rid of some of the spacing because we want to make this tight. So now this is what my code looks like. I'll just undo this so you can see it. Now there's a bit of an error, and the reason why is because I'm missing a bracket. There we go. We got to test it to see if it works. So first we'll test it by the actual running it, and the other one then we'll actually see if the test still passes. Right? We got to do that too, because after we refactor, we got to retest. Right? Let's just test this out and see if it works. So Control F5. Right? How many entries do I want to make? I want to make 3. Okay, I want to press end. Good to go. Right? Let's check it out one more time because we can't just do one test. Right? How many entries do I want to make? I want to make 3. So Tom, Mark, go. Good to go. So far it works from what it looks like. Let's check out if we can refactor the test. I'm going to bring the Test Explorer back in. After we refactor, does every test pass again? So I'm going to run all the tests again, and it looks like everything still passes. So that's how we refactored. And we went from a bunch of lines, right, to a few lines with a test in the while loop. One more thing to notice. We're always going to go through this do while at least once, right? And it's based on the assumption or assuming that the number of entries is always going to be greater than 0, right? But if the person doesn't want to make any entries, and if he says 0 or something like that, we're still going to go through it one time, right? Just FYI, which is going to cause an exception. It's going to cause us to throw an error, right? And remember, this is something we're going to handle later on. I want you to keep it in mind. How do I do some error handling here or potential problems? Because I'm trying to try parse a number, right, as an example, where the number, I'm assuming that the user is always going to be entering a proper number, right? Let's try this out again. And I'm not going to test for this right now because it's another concept we have to cover another time, right? But if I run the test, how many entries do I want to make? And I put the value F, right? Enter. We're going to get an error, and my code is going to crash. Why? Because f is it's trying to parse an f and make it into an integer. Can an f be an integer? No. A user can enter mistakes. He can put in a number and he wrote a mistake down, right? Well, what if instead of an integer he enters in a double 1.3? What's going to happen to that number? Will it get down converted? Let's see what happens. So what if I enter another something else like 1.3? Well, again, I have a problem. 1.3 is not an integer, so therefore it fails, right? So that's a problem for me. Okay, so here's a quick and dirty way to fix this problem. So I can guarantee that the user's got to enter a valid integer that's greater than 0, right? More than 0 entries is what I want to enter, right? We can wrap this whole thing, this piece right here, in something called a try-catch, all right? And we're going to cover this later on. Well, let's try this out. If I put try, and notice how I have, it actually has some code hinting in here. And if I press tab, right, it gives me the structure for my try-catch. This is the beginning of exception handling, is what it's called, right? I want to take my code. Here's my code in here. I want to cut it, and I want to put it inside my try. Right? Here it is. Then I'm going to get a generic exception, right? Okay. Here, what I want to do is output to the user a message, a friendly message saying, hey man, you got to enter in a valid number, right? And it's this way it'll never do the it'll never call my code, which is read until the end, right? So I got to put this also inside my try catch, so it never goes there with some weird thing. It won't error out like that, right? So it has to be a number that's greater than 0, right, or a valid number. It has to be an integer, right? Now, right now it'll accept 0 because 0 is a valid integer. 0, right? It'll catch. Is there anything like an unsigned integer that I can use instead? Unsigned int, right? I can do that as well instead of a regular integer. Remember, I can check for all kinds of things to try parse. Let's put inside in here a friendly message, console.writeLine. I want to use this. In the error, I'm going to put in something like this. You know, please enter a number, enter a valid or invalid number entered. Or invalid entry. How about this? Invalid entry. Right? Please enter an integer. Right? Okay. Right? This is very simple, right? So please bear with me while I try this. So if I press Control F5, right? I want to make D entries, right? And enter a valid number, enter a valid value. Uh-oh. Look, it says it actually went there, right? It went there. Invalid entry, please enter an integer. And when I press D, it still went to enter a value, right? And to stop. So somehow it still was able to go, even when it failed, into my number of entries. Read until end, went to the number of entries. Because I got to this line here, right, where I said enter a value somehow. Because my do loop, because of my do loop, right? I'm always going to go there. It tries to read this number up here. Here's my try-catch block. It didn't crash my code anymore because of my try-catch. My try-catch prevented the code from crashing, right? But, I still got this going with a number of entries because number of entries I initialized to 0. Okay, just saying. So here's how we fix that. Can I put a number of entries as nothing? Don't even initialize this at all, right? And see what happens. Because that was a valid value. Right now I don't have a valid value. Let's see if that works. So start, Control F5, and then I say I want to make D entries, right? Well, still it goes here, right? That's a problem. So again, this is something that we want to try and fix. And we got to fix it inside my method if I want to make sure that I can never have 0 or anything less than 0 entries, right? My number of entries can never be 0. And if it's true, if my number of entries is 0, right, then I never want to go there. And I want to do it here. I want to test to see if my number of entries is greater than 0, right? So let's try it here. If number of entries, right, is greater than 0, that's what we want to check. Then I can read until my number of entries. That's another safety check I'm putting in there, right? Are you guys following along? I know it's weird, and you're kind of watching. It's like you're watching me do this, right? But the reason why I'm putting this in there so you can understand how I'm trying to debug my code, so that way it's safe from user input, right? So number of entries. Now, if it's not greater than 0, I'm not going to read anything. And if I don't get a proper number from here, it's not going to be greater than 0, right? So therefore, I'll never go here. Let's try this out and see if I'm right. So run. How many entries? D. Right? Let's try running without debugging. Let's try this again. How many entries do I want to make? D. But here's the problem. D entries, somehow D entries didn't cause me to have an issue, didn't cause an exception. How come I didn't do this now? Right? Let's try that again. So Control F5. All right, let's try and ta-da, enter. No problem. And I didn't even get my try catch. Look, right? This catch piece didn't come into play at all. Well, this goes back to what we talked about before, which is I'm using a try parse. My integer try parse to get this. I'm using the out, right, which is going to take an entry. It's going to at least convert it to at least 0, right, if I don't understand something. So in this particular case, I can refactor by removing my try parse because it's never going there anyway. And I fixed my problem. Okay. Let me just do one of these, and I want to refactor. I want to fix my code, right? And one of the things I want to do when I fix my code is I want to kind of refactor or make sure it looks nice, right? One of the things I could do is I can manually do it, right? So I can go back to my code here and I can do one of these, right? Or I could right-click and arrange somehow, right? How is it that I can arrange or make it look nice? Is there a button or a key that I can use to make me do that? Is there? It's not organized, right? Let's look at that later on. Okay, so we understand what happened here. Let me test this one more time before this thing crashes on me, right? And to see if this works now the way it is with this if statement. All right, so I'll run it without debugging, make it quick, and then I'll put D entries, right? That'll still work. It's not going to crash, right? It won't give me some weird error. If I go into try this again with debugging and I put in 2 entries, it's still going to ask me for a couple of values, right? And if I run it with more than 0 entries, and if I say it's going to be, I don't know, 1 entry, I can put in an end and I can still stop. Either way, right? It's a little bit better. It's a little bit coded nicer than I had before. So I've refactored to the point where it's ready to go and to kind of be added into our little GitHub pool, right? So I'm going to go back to my Team Explorer. This is a great place to stop and take a short break because you guys are glazing. Changes. I know this is not exciting stuff, guys, but you need to understand how to develop an algorithm and a method that works, that doesn't cause errors, right? And this is what I'm trying to show you how to do. All right, so we'll add this in, and we'll say we added a test. That's what we did, and we refactored our code. So we added this read until end test method, read until end test method, and refactored code base. So we did. And home, and then I'm going to go to sync, and I'm going to push this to the GitHub repository. Okay, any questions before we take a short break? Okay, during the break, if for those people who are going to be around, I'll go over the test results from our quiz. Okay, so take a short break, and when we come back, I'll do the test results.